How does an army realize it is lost before the battle is officially over? Is it in the silence that follows a report no one wants to hear, or in the way men stop arguing because they already know the answer? What if defeat doesn't arrive with explosions and chaos, but with clarity, sudden, cold, and unavoidable? On the morning of December 26, 1944, the German High Command did not hear the sound of American tanks first. They felt something worse: certainty. The news reached the German headquarters in the Ardennes like a fracture spreading through glass, silent at first, then instantly undeniable. Snow lay heavy across the forests and roads, swallowing sound and motion, but it could not smother the truth carried into the room. The American encirclement at Bastogne had been broken. Not slowly, not after weeks of grinding delay, in less than 48 hours. And as the words were read aloud, the room seemed to shrink around them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood motionless over the map table. His hands gripped its edge, fingers curled, knuckles drained of color. Despite the heaters, the air was cold, thick with damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, and the quiet exhaustion of men who had gambled everything. Officers crowded the walls, their faces hollow, eyes locked on red and blue lines that no longer aligned with reality. Nearby stood General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, rigid, unreadable. He had commanded armored forces long enough to recognize disaster when it appeared, not as confusion, but as inevitability. Bastogne had been the hinge of the entire offensive. Hold it, and the American response would remain fractured. Lose it, and the Ardennes gamble would begin to collapse inward on itself. The officer delivering the report chose his words with care, as though precision might soften the blow. American armored spearheads from the south had reached Bastogne. The encirclement was broken. German units reported coordinated artillery, aggressive maneuver, resistance that did not falter. One name appeared again and again in intercepted messages and prisoner interrogations: Patton. Von Rundstedt closed his eyes for a brief moment. Everything had rested on assumptions: that the Americans would react slowly, that winter would paralyze them, and that confusion would buy Germany time. Bastogne had been surrounded. Roads were icy. Skies were sealed shut by cloud. Logic dictated delay. Patton had ignored logic entirely. General Alfred Jodl, representing the OKW, absorbed the implications in silence. The relief of Bastogne was not merely the saving of a town. It meant an entire American army had been redeployed with astonishing speed. It meant coordination, decisiveness, and a level of operational flexibility the German command could no longer summon. This was not improvisation, it was mastery. Manteuffel finally broke the silence. He turned south to north in winter, he said quietly, across snow and ice in less than 2 days. No one argued. For weeks, German intelligence had tracked Patton with wary respect. His reputation was well known: speed, relentless pressure, forcing decisions before the enemy could stabilize. Yet even those who feared him believed the terrain and weather would restrain him. Bastogne, he thought, would hold long enough to force concessions elsewhere. Instead, it had become a symbol of miscalculation. Messages kept arriving. German units reported American tanks appearing where none should have been. Supply routes were threatened. Artillery fire intensified. Inside Bastogne, the defenders, once frozen, isolated, and cut off, now fought with renewed ferocity, coordinating seamlessly with the relieving forces. Von Rundstedt straightened slowly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, stripped of illusion. This changes everything. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Everyone understood. The offensive had lived on speed and surprise. Once the Americans stabilized their lines, Germany's shortages, fuel, air cover, reserves, would assert themselves without mercy. Farther east, Field Marshal Walter Model received the same report. Hitler's so-called firemen, summoned again and again to collapsing fronts, read it twice. Then he folded the paper carefully and set it aside. His jaw tightened. "Patton," he muttered, not as an insult, but as a conclusion. Model understood instinctively. Where German doctrine had once prized initiative and movement, it was now shackled by rigid orders and political interference. Patton, by contrast, was unrestrained. He acted while others debated. Model turned to his staff. He acted while others debated. He turned to his staff. "We underestimated the speed of their command decisions," he said. "Not the men, the decisions." Outside, the snow continued to fall. German formations around Bastogne were already stretched thin. Fuel shortages crippled armored units. Tanks sat idle, engines cold, crews huddled for warmth. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Luftwaffe support was negligible, grounded by weather and scarcity. Against this backdrop, the arrival of fresh American forces was devastating. Reports from the front described columns advancing with grim determination, pressing forward despite the cold, despite resistance. German attempts to seal the breach met fierce opposition. Every mile gained cost men Germany could not replace. In Berlin, the news triggered fury. Adolf Hitler responded, as he always did, by rejecting reality. He blamed local commanders, accused them of weakness, demanded immediate counterattacks. Orders went out to retake Bastogne at once, to restore the encirclement, to prove German resolve. The generals listened, saluted, and returned to their maps, knowing what the Führer refused to accept. The moment had already passed. The moment had passed, even if no one was yet permitted to say it aloud. In the field around Bastogne, Manteuffel studied the frozen terrain, his eyes tracing lines of advance and withdrawal that no longer led to victory, only to containment. Experience told him what politics forbade him to acknowledge. An offensive that failed to secure its hinge points could only consume itself. Continuing meant bleeding strength Germany no longer possessed. Retreat, however logical, remained forbidden. Orders flowed downward, untouched by reality, demanding momentum where none could exist. Patton's relief of Bastogne had done far more than rescue an American division. It had exposed the fragility beneath the entire German plan. Quietly, among trusted company, German officers began to speak with rare honesty. Fuel reserves were counted not in weeks, but days. Divisions fought at fractions of their authorized strength. Vehicles stood abandoned for lack of gasoline. The idea of sustaining an offensive against an enemy with overwhelming logistics had become a fiction everyone recognized and no one could officially challenge. And always the conversation returned to Patton. There was no venom in their voices, only recognition. He had done what German commanders once believed was their exclusive domain: move faster than expectation, act before hesitation could harden into resistance, exploit opportunity without waiting for permission. On December 27th, fresh reports confirmed what they already knew. American pressure increased along multiple axes. Bastogne was no longer a problem to be solved. It had become the pivot around which the entire front turned. German formations were stretched thin, their flanks exposed, supply lines increasingly vulnerable to attack. Von Rundstedt convened another briefing. He looked older than before, his voice quieter, stripped of ceremony. "The Americans have regained the initiative," he said. "Once lost, it is rarely recovered." No one argued. Some officers found their thoughts drifting backward, to France in 1940, to the shock of Allied collapse, to German columns racing ahead while enemy headquarters struggled to comprehend events. Then speed belonged to Germany. Now the roles had reversed completely. Germany was reacting, always reacting, one step behind a battlefield that no longer waited. When the weather briefly cleared, Allied aircraft filled the skies. German troops looked up with weary resignation. Air superiority, once contested, was now absolute whenever conditions allowed it. Supply convoys were shredded. Road junctions vanished under bombs. Movement became something attempted only at night, cautiously, desperately. Bastogne had come to symbolize this transformation. Winter, once counted on as an ally, could no longer compensate for material inferiority and command paralysis. As December ground on, casualties mounted. Units pulled back under pressure, often without clear orders, seeking only to preserve what little strength remained. Bastogne faded from an objective to be reclaimed into a marker, a place where momentum had died. In private, Manteuffel would later reflect that it was there hope finally slipped away. Not in panic, not in catastrophe, but quietly, beneath snow-covered fields and expectations that could no longer be met. The Ardennes Offensive did not fail because of a single decision or even a single enemy commander. It failed because it demanded miracles from a nation already exhausted. Yet Patton's 48-hour relief of Bastogne gave that failure a face and a moment. It was when German generals understood that the war in the West was no longer about what might still be achieved, but about what could no longer be avoided. Maps were revised, arrows shortened, then turned back. Orders shifted from advance to defense, from ambition to survival. And through every recalculation, one name lingered, not as a boastful adversary, but as an unavoidable truth. Speed had returned to the battlefield, and it no longer belonged to Germany.